Okay, so we're gonna get started. So good morning, everybody, and happy Friday. On behalf of the board of the Delaware Valley chapter of ACRL, as well as the program planning committee for today's event, I want to welcome each and every one of you and thank you for giving your time and being here today. My name is Jasmine Woodson. I'm the president of the DVC chapter of ACRL. And I want to take a minute or two before we begin today's event to give a bit of context to help frame this event so that we move into this time that we're about to spend together with intention. So the program planning committee this year, we wanted to both allow for flexibility in programs that are responsive to community needs, but also to have continuity that would allow for the ongoing reflection and dialogue that are essential to community building, growth, and change. So our chapter's events for this year, and this is the third in a series of events that we hope to continue into spring, rather than have a theme, are rooted in these three guiding questions. So these questions are, what factors shape our professional values and beliefs for better and for worse? How do systemic oppression and racism more specifically shape library and archives work? And how can our work serve as a vehicle for social change? So today's event, as the title, a title taken from Emerson and inscribed in the very halls of the Library of Congress implies, grapples with a construct that we use every day and come to know and understand the world with, that is so fundamental to the work of libraries and to discovery, yet perhaps that we take the most for granted, language. Words are also actions, and actions are a kind of words. So please keep that quote and those questions in mind as you take in the knowledge and expertise of our panelists, and think about how you might take up those questions in your own context. So just to briefly go over the schedule for the day. So we're gonna move into introductions from our panelists, then we're gonna have a moderated panel discussion. After that, we'll have time for audience Q&A, and then we'll have a really brief wrap up. If you do have questions for our panelists, at any point, you can just use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom screen to submit your question there. And also, please, please, please feel free to use the chat to dialogue with each other, because that adds another layer of richness to this event. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, our panel moderator and panelists. And our moderator is Dr. Stephanie Gomez, who is the past president of ACRL DVC.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. I'm so glad to be here and having this conversation. And I'm so glad that they could join us. I am the library director at Cedar Crest College, a small liberal arts college in Pennsylvania in the Lehigh Valley. And take it away. Who wants to go first? Jill, do you want to go first? You're at the top of my screen.
Hi, thanks, Stephanie. Hi, everybody who's joined us today. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Jill Barron, and I'm a librarian at Dartmouth College and one of the filmmakers of Change the Subject. And yeah, it's really an honor to be included in this program. It's still pretty astonishing to me that I think we first screened the film in April of 2019, that screenings are still happening, that COVID has not dampened the appetite for engaging with this film. So I'm really, really astonished by that and grateful for it. I think when we set out to make this, it felt really important to document both the story, but also the voices of the people involved in the effort. And for me, it was really just that. I mean, I wanted to sort of have an impact in some way, but the story itself was what was so important to me and personal, and also sort of, of professional importance to me. I never expected to have an impact on how libraries are addressing the problem in their local catalogs, or even that, we would be sitting in a screening in a Q&A like this today. So that's really exciting, and gives me some hope about our profession. And I guess I'll end it there. Thank you.
Okay, Dr. Lourdes Gutierrez Najera.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for inviting me here. So first, I want to thank the organizers for bringing us together. So thank you very much. I'm really excited to be here and join you from, even, as I said, from the West Coast. I also want to thank the co-panelists. I'm so excited to be able to be in the same space with Jill and with Melissa, and to be able to share together our part of our journey through this film and this process. I also want to acknowledge, do a little bit of a land acknowledgement. So I just want to acknowledge that I'm joining you from the territory of the Nooksack and Lummi people. It is the ancestral homeland of the Salish Sea coastal peoples as well. So want to do that. And then just give you a little bit of background. This project is very dear and personal, I think, to all of us. For me, my research is largely on immigration, mostly Indigenous Latinx migration. But this work to me is personal because I actually am an immigrant myself, and I was born on the US-Mexico border. And so I grew up really hearing a lot of the kinds of words and language that assaults us, and that can be damaging, right? So a lot of these negative words, like illegal, as a child. And I think I'm glad I had fortitude to be able to sort of like brush them off as a young person. But it's really important that we have these conversations. So my work in some ways has always been to try and understand even my own positionality and my own experiences, and how those differ from those of my neighbors, my cousins, other family members who also came to the United States or have grown up here. So when I was at Dartmouth, and Oscar, who is also in the film, invited me to advise this group of young people and co-fired, I was really excited because it felt, like it's exactly the kind of work that I want to do. It's where my heart is. And so what you see in the film also is just the kind of like, I would say, like, even loving relationship we all had with one another. And so I think that I was just so honored to be able to help them and to work with them and to learn from them. And so I'll close it with that. Thank you.
Thank you. Melissa Padilla.
I think it's so unfair that I get to go after both of these really lovely introductions. But yeah, so I'm Melissa Pedilla. I am one of the filmmakers and one of the subjects of the film. I don't really have any professional like title. I'm not in academia. I'm actually in consulting, but I'm really interested in continuing this filmmaking vein that kind of Jill sparked in me whenever she came to me with the idea of creating this story into a documentary. I'm also really excited to be here. Thank you all for inviting me into your space, and for the organizers for reaching out. It's really interesting to see that there are others who are interested in this topic. I grew up in a really small town in Georgia where I was the only one thinking about these things. And then I went to Dartmouth, and I saw there were others from other parts of the country who were from the immigrant community or not that were also thinking about it. And then now to see that it's beyond Dartmouth's campus, it's really community members that I didn't know were part of my community. So it's really, really lovely to be with you today, and looking forward to the conversation.
Wonderful. I'm going to start. I'm going to ask questions, and then I'm going to take my picture off so all the focus can be on all of you. But okay, so one of our guiding questions for the year is about professional values and how they challenge or uphold the status quo. How does systemic oppression and racism, more specifically, shape library and archives work? In the documentary, we see the ways in which a practice librarians largely have regarded as neutral, cataloging, is anything but, and is in fact racist. From your unique perspectives, what are ways that librarians, libraries, as well as scholars and educators in higher education develop a practice of critical reflection such that we are continually doing the work of dismantling racism and injustice? So whoever wants to go take it away.
I'm happy to start at least. So thank you for that question. And I think it's a really good one. And I think that, you know, so much of library work is very process oriented, right? There are these sort of paths that we take in order to get certain tasks done. I think it's also a lot of library work, both behind the scenes and working with the public, is very goal oriented and thing oriented, right? Like we need to get the patron to the thing. And so it's really easy when you're so conditioned in certain processes and certain types of goals to lose touch with problems that are right there in front of you, and that maybe you just don't even see because you are so sort of single-mindedly focused on the end result. And I know I'm speaking for myself when that's exactly what happened when I interacted with Melissa that day, that, you know, I'm an intelligent person. I read books. I keep up with the world, and yet, you know, this problem that was right in front of my face was like invisible to me because I was so focused on sort of just the methods that we use in order to connect patrons with information. So I think for me, you know, that moment was like really like this, you know, watershed moment where I realized that, you know, I don't have that's not okay. And that like, I can't dissociate, you know, process from the impact of racism, right? Or the impact of or on the ways that racism and really just problems with our processes are really embedded in them. So I think it's really important. And what I've been seeing, what's been really interesting, I just want to add one more thing, is that I have been seeing sort of I would say an evolution, and that's been really exciting, where over the past few years, and it's certainly coinciding with, you know, the Trump era, but I think that many library workers are becoming much more critically minded, and not that they weren't before, but are really sort of looking at our institution in different ways and with the different perspectives. And so that's really exciting. And one piece about values that I just find so fascinating as a result of this film, and sort of unexpected, is that, you know, we're seeing a lot of libraries commit to making local changes in their catalogs of this particular subject heading. And to me, that's like a really interesting turn in the profession, because so much of our profession is guided by, and I would say the values of the profession is really guided by, you know, sort of a belief in standards, right? Like holding to the standard, efficiency, interoperability, like making things easier, quicker, making the process more slick, right? But, you know, what do we lose when we prioritize that? And I think what we lose is sort of an awareness, an engagement with the critical issues that are really most important in our society, right? So that's been exciting for me to see libraries prioritize things other than those values, and to kind of stop and be like, well, this is hard work, but we're willing to commit our resources to this. And I think that that reflects a real shift in values in the profession.
Well, if I can just add to that, I think for me, one of the important lessons from this film is just thinking about the importance of putting sort of like our convictions into action. So many, you know, I see that, you know, at different institutions, so many people like espousing, you know, like the rhetoric of social justice, but not willing to you know, to really like put themselves like out there. And so I think that, you know, when we're talking about dismantling racism, I think we have to not only speak about convictions, but actually act on them. And I think that in this film, that's exactly what happened. You know, you see the power of like everyone sort of actually really trying to do something, right? Understanding that this word is racist, that it's impactful, that it's hateful, that it's hurtful, and then a real commitment to actually trying to change things, right? And so I think that it takes that kind of action. You know, as an educator, for me, you know, when we're talking about dismantling racism and injustice, it's that action, you know, in many ways, whether it's working with groups or in the classroom. You know, so I think we have to have these difficult conversations. I think for so long, you know, K through 12, you're fed a particular narrative about this country, right? And so, you know, we have to challenge those dominant narratives, and we have to dismantle them, right? So the meritocracy is not real, right? Not everybody is able to achieve the same sort of prosperity, and we have to dismantle this notion of like citizenship being like the end all and be all, because, you know, if we go back to the origins of this country, citizenship, remember, was for landed white elite men. It did not, it was not given to everybody, all right? It wasn't until 1924 that indigenous people are given actually a recognition, full recognition as subjects. And so I think we have to have these conversations, and we have to like really work in our classrooms to expose students then to alternative narratives, to, you know, to really dismantle the kinds of messages that they're getting every day in the media, and I think that that's part of the work, and that's partly where it begins for us. So.
I'm not a librarian, I'm not an academic, but just from the student point of view, I think about I always go back to the meeting with Jill and think about the things that worked and that made it possible for me to have that conversation with Jill, mostly because there is a power structure, right? And that Jill is the expert. She's the librarian. She's the one that has the answers. I am the student coming to her with the lack of knowledge. And so being in that meeting, just it made me realize that there was a way in which Jill was able to kind of dictate this like weird social like understanding that we have about power, and who has the ability to speak and who has the ability to dictate what the conversation is going to be, that um, I would just kind of share with the group, be open to kind of letting this power hierarchy that we have in our heads kind of go. We're all kind of community members, and we're all coming at this from very different ways. It's not an easy answer, and I don't know if there's a lot of practicality there, but it was something that really made everything that followed from that conversation just really a collective kind of push that I think is kind of beautiful on its own.
Okay, so thank you. I can't tell you, I'm so happy right now that we're having this conversation. I'm hearing you say the things that you're saying. It's not often that we get this opportunity. Okay, so next question. In what ways did this experience impact your conception of citizenship? Has that since changed given the events in America in the past 4 years, in particular, the incessant use of dehumanizing language to describe Central and South American immigrants?
I can kick it off if you guys don't mind. I think my relationship to quote unquote citizenship is kind of an interesting one with a lot of nuances and a lot of evolution. I grew up in this country and documented, and so for a lot of my life, citizenship was the goal towards safety, where everything was going to be okay, where I wasn't going to be in fear of, being separated from my family or whatever it was that, the worst case scenario, right? It was the answer to not having that. And then before coming to Dartmouth, I had the chance to get a green card. And then that question of citizenship was, in my mind, the answer to being okay. And then it wasn't okay, right? Because you look back and you see other people who don't have the chance to have this green card or the social security number, and you think there's no like overnight. I as a person didn't change. I received a piece of plastic. But I'm no different. I still have the same fears. Those fears don't go away in my relationship to government and to quote unquote these social norms are still the same. I still feel like I don't belong. I still feel all of these things that I felt when I was undocumented. And the people who didn't get that green card also hadn't changed. They were still the same hardworking community members that I knew. And it just seemed very unreasonable to me that I was the one getting the privilege to have this protection. And then I go to Dartmouth and I kind of start going into the nuance of what citizenship is and what it belongs. And even thinking about this year and even the past 4 years and all of the things that have been happening with the Trump administration and even things that started with the Obama administration, I really think about this term of citizenship and just kind of think it's bullshit. Quite frankly, it's a term that um, that government gives to us, but it in no way, shape, or form has anything to do in the everyday ways in which we kind of fulfill this act of citizenship. And so I think I even talk about it in the documentary, my question of like whether the goal should be citizenship, because I think the real goal that we're all kind of searching for is liberation, and we kind of conflate it with citizenship in a lot of ways. And I know I'm coming at it from a very privileged position of, as someone who wasn't documented, getting a green card and now being a US citizen, but I really think there's a lot of different ways in which we're not thinking about citizenship that I wish we were. Jill, Professor Najera, do you guys have any thoughts you want to add here?
There we go. You have to unmute yourself. Imagine that. So I was just going to add to that. I think if we look at, this question of citizenship is so interesting, right? And Melissa, you do such a nice job of thinking about that experience. And you're right, citizenship doesn't guarantee you equality. So if we look at the Women's March, at the No DAPL movement, at the immigrant rights movement, or more recently at Black Lives Matter and all the racial violence that is like in our country, right, at the present moment, what we have to clearly understand is that citizenship does not guarantee equality. Citizenship does not guarantee that you will be treated humanely, right? And so I think that this is again where where I was talking earlier, we have to sort of dismantle these ideas that we have, because fundamentally, what what we're supposedly guaranteed by the Constitution, it just doesn't happen for everybody, right? And so we live in a society that is unequal, fundamentally unequal. And especially when you're BIPOC, you do not receive the same guarantees in life, because let me tell you, when you have like the racist policies enacted by Trump, so things like the bans, just the fact that you look like a particular kind of subject makes you suspect and makes you deportable. Right? Think about all the Latinx folks who have been deported or like put in deportation hearings, despite the fact that they're citizens, right? And so we really have to think about these things.
I'm just sitting here like learning from both of you. So It's really great. I don't have anything to add. Just hearing you talk is making me think about sort of the citizenship again as like a thing, and as almost like an individual goal, when really, the emphasis or the experience of liberation is communal, right? It's shared. Like I won't be liberated until you're liberated kind of idea, right? And so yeah, that's what that made me think about.
Great, thank you so much. The next question, would you talk a little bit about the umbrella terms that are used to talk about the people of Latin American heritage in the United States? It's useful to have these terms, but there's little agreement on which terms are correct. For example, Latinx, which I often use, is currently popular as a non-binary label that is more inclusive than Latinos. However, the label has a lot of inherent problems. For instance, it is an English word that cannot be pronounced easily in Spanish, and it can't be used conversationally. Also, that Latinx is used mostly by academics could be interpreted as being imposed from the outside and therefore colonizing. I'm wondering if you could speak to that a little in general, as well as to how you believe librarians should proceed with these labels within their cataloging.
Thank you. I'll initiate this conversation. So, the question of umbrella terms, can go far back, but I think one of the things that we need to also understand is how these umbrella terms have been used or how they started. And we have to remember that some of these terms that are used actually in the United States are institutional, right? So they've been used to sort of like to count us by the census, so by the US government. So these terms really began basically that way, so you can think of in the 1960s, the first emergence of the first umbrella term really that's used to lump us together is Hispanic. And Hispanic is just that category that says we're all united through our language, right? And of course, all umbrella terms have problems, right? So when you're thinking about Latin American immigrants and you're including folks, for example, from Brazil who are not Spanish speakers, then they are omitted from these categories, right? They don't fit in. So any category has these problems with exclusion, right? So we went from Hispanic as an umbrella category, and you see that umbrella category is still used and it is still present in the census, right? So you go from that to then envisioning something larger. Okay, they're from Latin America, they're Latinos, right? So Latinos, and so then of course Latino with an O is masculine, right? And so to have something more gender inclusive, then we went from the Latino to / Latino / A or Latina, but those categories are still exclusive. They're exclusive of people who are non-gender conforming, right? And so the next iteration was this umbrella term with Latino with the @ sign, right? But again, that presented problems because if you think the X is difficult, how do you pronounce that? And so these terms, though, again, are embraced by certain people over others. You can see how the @ sign would have been something that would have been embraced by non-gender conforming people, right? At this moment in time, the current moment, we're using Latinx, right? And Latinx, I should note, it's actually not, we tend to think like it's a new category, but it actually emerged in 2004, and it arises from the queer and LGBTQ community, right? And so, but it's not until 2014 that it actually gained sort of more popular currency. And so that's what we have right now, Latinx. And the X is supposed to be there again because it is non-gender conforming, but much more inclusive, right? For those who suggest that it doesn't adhere to Spanish orthography and norms of language, some would argue that in fact the Latinx, that X is there as a way to sort of reclaim identity, that it is decolonial because it goes against that grain, that it is a rebellion against an imperial language because even the use of Spanish, right, was imposed on the Americas. And so Latinx, at least in my view, is a term that I embrace because it is the most inclusive, right? It is an identity that, you know, that many folks can sort of like relate to, right? That, or identify with. Not only is it non-gender conforming, but because it's like that, because it is much more inclusive, you see that, you know, that there are Afro-Latinx people, that there are Latinx indigenous people who also are able to embrace this category, signaling difference, nonconformity to that hegemonic term of Latino or Latina or Hispanic that has for so long excluded the diversity of of Latinidades or Latinx experience, right? We see that, excuse me, very recently in the debates over the elections. Remember when people were debating the Latino vote? And so you have all these folks who said, hey, there is no such thing because we are much more diverse than this. And so I think Latinx for now, we know language changes, but Latinx at this moment in time, to me, appears to be the most inclusive term. So I think we should embrace it. As far as cataloging, all right, cataloging, it's a tricky question because language does change. Excuse me. And so we don't know like what the next iteration might be. And so I think that, you know, that in some ways it's going to be up to the convictions of like maybe local universities to think about the ways in which they want to sort of think about these terms as well. Maybe Jill can actually speak to this a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and thank you, Lourdes, for that. Panorama view of sort of the various names and labels. I think for cataloging, it is super tricky, and as long as we continue working in the same ways that we do, I think that cataloging will always be very slow to reflect the either behind in terms of reflecting the preferred terms, or just wrong in the case of, you know, illegal aliens. So I think, you know, that kind of makes us think about, or should make us think about, you know, what else is possible, right? Like if the current system that we're working in isn't working, if it's failing us, then what's the alternative? And so then I think it's a really it's a bigger conversation. It's a conversation that requires imagination and a willingness to like, you know, burn down, right? Burn down the systems, burn down the house that we live in. And that's scary, but I think, you know, it's a really good conversation to have because, you know, we you know, the film is about the process between trying to behind demanding a change in a subject heading, and one that became very politicized, you know, that was probably politicized from the moment the Library of Congress received the petition back in 2014, but especially so after the media and Capitol Hill got their hands in it. So, you know, I think it's always going to be a very fraught exercise to try and come up with a term to describe people when those terms do and need to change. And, you know, people need to be thinking critically all the time about the words we use to describe ourselves. And one last thing I want to add is that, you know, I was in a Q&A, or I wasn't on the panel, but I was attending a Q&A at Indiana University. I think it was week or two ago, maybe some of you in the audience were there, that was really about the cataloging issues presented in the film. And so Tina Gross was a panelist, John DeSantis, and Tim Thompson from Yale. And, you know, they talked about how, you know, with linked data, there are like all kinds of possibilities for local institutions to make choices about the kinds of labels that do display, while still kind of interoperating at a system level the way that the Library of Congress subject headings allow us to do. And that was really, really interesting and exciting to hear. And yet that's kind of a technology that isn't yet implemented or isn't yet sort of happening. So I think that there probably are solutions, but it will take imagination to reach them.
Okay, do you have anything to add, Melissa, or should I go on to the next question?
No, you take it away, Stephanie. There's nothing more intelligent that I could add to this conversation.
Okay, the next one I guess goes on, continues this a little bit, and it's more about cataloging itself. So we're asked if any of you have any experience with user tagging or similar user created categorizing systems. There has been some of this happening in academic libraries, probably more so in archives, though it hasn't become a widely employed practice yet. What are your thoughts on libraries and archives integrating user-driven methods of classification into our various systems?
I'm not a cataloger or a librarian, but really quickly, but I think, you know, this question, you know, just listening to Jill, I think that, again, to me, it just seems like such a complex system. And one of the, I imagine the challenges is, you know, if we have all these user-based classifications, right, and there are different terms being used, what links them together? And so regardless of what's used, you still need some sort of umbrella term to be able to bring them together. And so it doesn't diminish that, right? Like how do you then, because how do you make these different catalogs speak to each other? And so I think it's a really tricky thing.
Yeah, I agree. And, you know, I'm not a cataloger. And so it's kind of hard for me to address this. Like, yeah, in theory, I like the idea of user tagging. And I think that's, there's, you know, certainly in my personal life, I use tagging in my use of Instagram and you know, other social media platforms. And we see that, you know, that is a way. So I don't know. I think that this is a question that's more geared for, you know, folks that kind of are more involved in cataloging. But I think it's an interesting idea also in terms of revealing, you know, inviting input and revealing the importance of metadata. I think, you know, most people that use libraries they don't think about subject headings. They don't think about the ways that we organize our information and, you know, sort of some kind of tagging initiative would sort of demand that users engage on that level, on the sort of aboutness level of an item. But how they do it, I don't know.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, next question. Alex Gill, a librarian from Columbia University, has created a digital archive in which, with the help of colleagues, he has mapped out the ICE detention centers in the US. It's called Torn Apart Separados. What the project demonstrates is that, practically speaking, the dangers of the border exist everywhere, not simply along the physical border of Mexico. So people are being held just a few miles from where I'm speaking in PA. My question is, do you have any thoughts on what we as librarians can do to resist and protest this injustice and make the individuals impacted more visible?
I'll go ahead and start the conversation on this. As I said, I grew up on the border, so I'm very much aware of the physicality of the border. I'm also aware that the border, that we place a lot of emphasis on the physical border, right? But that actually, that borders exist everywhere because of language, because of, different signs and symbols, because of what we wear, right? So if I wear a hijab, that creates a boundary oftentimes, right? Language will create a barrier. So I think for me, while I don't want to diminish the importance of this, but acknowledging that borders are everywhere, I think for me, one of the useful distinctions that I like to make, and that might be useful for librarians and others as well, is the distinction between borders and bordering. And I think that one of the things that this signals is like bordering processes. And I think for me, the idea of bordering is much more capacious and generative in thinking about the ways in which all of us, right, create boundaries, on a daily basis, whether it's through language or our actions. But I think that the notion of bordering really gets at that, right? And so you're right, it doesn't stop at the US physical border, right? We also have the Canadian border, but we tend to focus only on one. But we can think of bordering processes, and I think that we need to become more aware, all of us, which kinds of barriers we're putting up, what kinds of borders we're erecting. Are they linguistic? Are they racial? Are they ethnic? Are they gendered? Are they based on sexuality? That we need to interrogate the ways that each of us then contribute, right, to border or boundary making processes. And so that would be the one thing that I would hope that we could all sort of like embrace.
Melissa, do you want to add anything?
I think I'd go back to what I mentioned in the first question about power. And I think this kind of goes hand in hand with what Professor Najera has just shared, and that I think a lot of the work that we all need to do collectively is kind of chip away at this idea of power and who has the right to make the decision, who has the right to speak up when it's a collective issue, as we all see, right? The borders are physical, but they're everywhere. And we thought they were out, on the southern border with Mexico or with Canada, when in reality, they're everywhere. I went and visited a friend in New York City, and she was scared to get on a subway because technically New York City is on the border, right? I don't think about it like that, but it is. And I think about friends from Dartmouth who lived on the West Coast and trying to get home from for Thanksgiving holiday or for a holiday, really having to grapple with the idea of, if I go on a train nowhere near the border, but close to it, it's possible that an ICE agent can get on a train and change my life in 1 second. And so those are conversations about power and about community that we all kind of need to think about. But I think they're ongoing. I think it's naive of us to say that we can have the conversation once and kind of get through it and fix the problem, when in reality, this evolution of power, this system of capitalism and white supremacy is evolving as we chip away at it. So I think it's a continual process that we always need to rediscover and have with one another. And power goes into it because it's uncomfortable to shift the power dynamic of, I think it would have been easy for Jill as a librarian to say, I'm the one with the power. You as a student, I've listened to you, but that's it, right? Like, I don't have to do anything beyond that. When in reality, I think she did a wonderful job of kind of evening this weird power dynamic that is kind of unspoken about, but is there, and had that conversation. And I'm sure it didn't feel comfortable, Jill. I might be speaking for you, but I'm sure it wasn't comfortable. It wasn't comfortable for me. But I think it's an issue that we have to be uncomfortable about. It's a issue where we need to recognize that there are these unspoken power dynamics that we're not thinking about, that we need to chip away at. And I think it's an issue of there is no end goal. It's a continual marathon, and we kind of have to have the strength to make it to this end line that is there, but we're working towards.
Yeah, I think that, what you just said, Melissa, is such a great example or expression of what Lourdes was describing, or it kind of opened with this bordering as being everywhere, as being in us, in our communities, in, our work. And so to kind of, it's just always there. And it's something that I think, we always have to be really vigilant against. And to bring it back to the question and the sort of Alex's project, which is a great project. And I think it's a really, and what do librarians need to do to resist and protest? I think it's like using the tools at our disposal. And I think that's something Alex did. He is a programmer. He can he can work with big data sets. He can visualize data sets. And he did that in a really impactful way. He also brought together a lot of different people. It was a big team that pulled off that project. And so he did that through the power of his network and his, approaching a problem not as an individual trying to fix something, but as, a member of a collective that cares about the same issues and wants to sort of build knowledge and share knowledge. And I think that we all can do that at our own levels with our own toolboxes that we have. And so, my particular skill set is listening, and I don't really have much else. And, and wanting to engage and wanting to learn, right? And I think it kind of goes back to what Melissa's talking about with, about power, is really recognizing that the person sitting with you that's there to, learn something from you as a librarian also has equally or more knowledge that you can learn from. So really shifting that notion of sort of hierarchy, right? And really dismantling it right there and then, because Melissa has this tremendous knowledge, life experience, expertise, and things I don't, right? And so, there's an opportunity there. And I, and again, want to say it also is important. It's critical to have a willingness to sort of, I know we talk about this a lot lately, you have to be uncomfortable, right? But discomfort is being the means of growth. But I do kind of believe in that. And I do really believe in that. And I think that, Melissa in that moment had the strength to speak up and say what is going on there in a way that, I don't think everybody would. And she sort of opened a conversation there, even though it was uncomfortable. It was necessary. And so I really credit Melissa with having that strength to do that. And so I think this is all to say, we have to recognize that the bordering process is constantly at work, and our society is built to reinforce that tendency. And so we constantly have to kind of do things like open ourselves up, listen, say hard things, and be willing to kind of work through those things.
If I can just say one more thing, I think as Melissa talked, it reminded me of this first line out of this book by Donnan and Wilson on borders. But the line, I use it in my classes all the time, but it's this notion that borders are sites and symbols of power. I think that's really important, right? And so, yes, so we need to remember that, because that's what's at work. And so you're right. So they have the power to define us, right? So the word, and remember, and through bordering, so we're thinking about like things like language. So the language we use is imbued with power and has the power then to determine people's lives. Think about what's happening at the border with, you know, young children being put in cages because they've been dehumanized. That's about bordering, right? And that's about power. And so I think that, you know, I like the way you both sort of spoke about this. And Jill, I think what you bring about, it's like, it's not just the words, you know, that librarians need to think about or what you encounter in the catalog, but it's also about you, the person, and how you also are contributing to, you know, these kind of boundary making or bordering processes. And so that's the only way to sort of dismantle them. It's not just by saying, oh, okay, it's in this book, or like it's in this language codified. Yes, it's there, but it's also, you know, but we need to sort of reflect and think like, how are we also contributing to this, right? And so that the two need to go together, and that that's the only way to really make true change. So thank you both for like those insights.
Wonderful, thank you. Do any of you have any additional insights into how libraries and librarians can support undocumented students without needing them to identify themselves?
I can take this one. I might be beating a dead horse when I kind of talk about power, but I always put myself in that meeting with Jill. And I will preface by saying that I wasn't undocumented at the time. I had a green card. So that being said, that question that led me to ask Jill, like, well, why are you using that word, came from many years of being undocumented, and something that I shared with Jill after the fact. And so I think it again goes back to just this willingness to listen, and this willingness for it to feel less like I have a meeting in 30 minutes, so like can you wrap this up? Like I don't have time to think about this beyond the time I've allotted in the calendar hold, or however many minutes I've set aside. I think it was a really just human moment where I really felt like Jill was listening, and even seeing her reaction to my question of not like complete, I have an answer and this is it. She really sat there and thought like, oh, well, and then she talked me through the process. And even after the fact, I could see that she was still kind of thinking through like what she said, because I pushed back a couple of times after she shared about cataloging and how the system worked. And I think my questions kind of prodded her to kind of ask too, like, oh yeah, well, like, why do we? And like, I guess that word is not okay. Like, why do we use it? All this to say, it's genuinely this human aspect of being able to listen. As someone who grew up undocumented, I always felt like because I didn't quote unquote have citizenship of belonging, I never had the right to speak up and kind of push back against what was, like I was a guest in this house. Why was I going to ask a question beyond what was, given to me? And in this situation with Jill, I didn't feel that way. I really felt like I had the ability to ask, and she kind of chipped away at power and made it really human, and said, okay, I'm willing to learn from it. Even after the fact, she kind of followed up with me afterwards. And then even throughout the weeks after, whenever the freedom budget came out and that was a part of it, she could have very easily just kind of said, oh, okay, that happened. But she on her own kind of took it upon herself to connect with others in the library, to connect the students, to keep the movement going. And so all this to say, it is genuinely this feeling like you're a community member, that you're willing to listen, that you're not just going to disregard the fact. And then that's not a pretty statement to say. I think the human aspect of it is a lot harder than like a manual. You do 1, 2, 3, and everything's okay. But it is genuinely as simple as that.
If I can just say really quick, I think empathy is one of the words that I'm thinking of. Like, I can tell you as the advisor for this group of students, Melissa came to our meeting and said, hey, like, I was doing this research and this is the term that's in the catalog and it's really messed up, and so what should we do? We're like, well, let's do something about it. So they went with some trepidation also to the librarians, but it also took the willingness and just openness. And that is one of the things that actually was surprising, like that they weren't closed off and that these librarians kind of came together and were like, you're right, we see this. We don't, like, and then that sort of collaboration, right? Like, and so Melissa, you were talking about allyship the other day, but like the willingness to work together and say, okay, we can help you through this process. We have a particular kind of knowledge around the Library of Congress, but you have the experience and the knowledge around these words and where this information is. So working together, but that openness and like, I don't know if it was excitement around it, but definitely just like that deep desire I saw within the library staff, the ones that worked with our students, like to really help them, right? And to really be able to, to have come to terms and agreed that change needed to be made, and then work with them. And so I think that also, so it's openness, but also empathy, right? That Jill, that the others could really listen to them and come to understand the damage, the potential damage that this word had on them. And so I think about that. So I think when we're thinking about supporting them, it's really about sort of having empathy, listening, but really trying to like be an ally. So when you're thinking like how can they support them, I think be an ally, right? Whether it's helping them gather resources or there's many different ways to sort of be supportive, but I think the main way is just being open, listening, right? Sharing resources and letting them see that like maybe you can't put yourself in that position that they're in, but that you can see, right, how it affects them and that it's problematic. And I think that in itself, that openness really helped create then this wonderful relationship that you continue to see even through the film and afterwards. So today, the fact that we're all here, it's through that relationship and friendship that was forged from this. And so, and so much of that really is in credit to Jill, who spearheaded this. So
I just want to thank you, Lourdes, and like I just want to add that I think there also needs that with the openness and the listening, there also needs to be a willingness to experience some conflict, right? And to like kind of hear what you might not want to hear, right? Because ultimately, that term was the designated term. And what does that say about our institution, about our profession, that is so, right? And so we had to do some kind of a reckoning, right? I mean, I think that the whole experience forced a reckoning, not just personally, which it did, but I think professionally, right? And what do we have to be willing to do in order to enact, to go back to Lourdes's comment earlier, to really act or enact our values of openness, of wanting to serve all, et cetera, et cetera. So I think, sometimes, working with folks and liaising and outreach and, also involves a bit of having to hear what you don't want to hear, right? and being willing to do that, because it is I'm sure intended for progress.
Great, wonderful. How has your experience with this documentary changed your outlook on advocacy, agency, grassroots approaches to institutional change? The reaction to the documentary and also your work trying to change.
If you want to, I can start. I think for me, one of the things that was really important was just seeing, like, and you can see it in the film, but the importance of us as educators, right? So it's not just librarians, but also as educators, as professors, the role that we can also play, right? And that that it's not just us being in the classroom, but also being able to work alongside students and also empower students to be able to do, I think, the work that they want to do, but often maybe doubt themselves. And so that we have the capacity to serve them, right? And to work with them to sort of help them get there. And so I think just like with librarians, everything that Jill has said about librarians also is true of us. And so it's really important. And so again, I think for me, it really brought home then the role that I can play in the lives of students, right? The importance of being there as a resource, as a listener, right? As sometimes as a friend, a shoulder to cry on, whatever is needed, right? But that I am instrumental in this also, and that I had that power, right, to be able to do that and provide things for them that maybe they didn't have access to. And so for me, that's one of the things that was really brought home. And I have to say, part of that, I didn't see that. I mean, I was just doing it, but in some ways, it took Jill who signaled that out to me also at some point in time, and so I've really kind of embraced that. And so I think what we need to do, or what it brought to me, is that I need to do more of that with intentionality as well, and as I approach my students on a day-to-day.
No, you go, Jill.
I don't know. I was just going to, I think it's a good question. And, institutional change is so slow and frustrating. And I think a lot about how, what's the best approach? Not that there is one, but, is it a groundswell from the bottom up? Or is it sort of very targeted, influence campaign, right? Of the people that actually pull the levers in an institution. And I don't know. I mean, the bottom up strategy, I think it's incredibly powerful, because what it does is it creates, it's it's the, what's the word I'm looking for? A concerted mass. I forget, there's an expression, but it gets to the point where it's nobody can avoid seeing it anymore. It's kind of like the $15 an hour question, when Bernie Sanders, and I'm sure there are others, but he started campaigning on that, and everyone's oh, that's crazy, what a wackadoo, right? And then I don't know, you just keep hearing it, and you keep hearing it, and there's more and more and more, and suddenly you're that's totally reasonable, right? It should be more than that. So I think grassroots is really powerful, and I see that with the impact of the film is that I'm seeing more and more and more libraries commit to making local changes. People are working on different ILS systems. There are different approaches for making local changes. there is not a one size fits all, but I think more and more institutions are realizing like we can't just not do anything, right? Like this is so pervasive that we can't not make this change. So I think that's great. It is exhausting though to be in a grassroots movement. It's exhausting. You know, have to suffer a lot of abuse, especially at the beginning when people think you're crazy for wanting to do whatever it is. And so, yeah, critical mass, thank you. So yeah, but I think it's really important. I also think, you know, once that critical mass exists, then, you know, it is possible to influence the people that are decision makers. And so, also, something I've heard Oscar say a lot is that he says shame is a very powerful mechanism for bringing about change. And like, that's so true. You know, I think like the more people realize that like something is shameful, you know, and if you don't do something about it, like that is shameful, then you're more compelled to act.
I think the only thing I'd add here goes back to this notion of allyship. I think as someone who came up from the grassroots movement here in Georgia with undocumented students, and then kind of doing a lot of grassroots work at Dartmouth in New Hampshire, I would say that this notion of allyship and knowing that you have allies in places you least expected was something that I certainly took out of this experience. I certainly, if you would have asked me in 2013, hey, Melissa, are you about to campaign for this, you know, national level, you know, change with librarians, I would have said, absolutely not. That's never going to happen. And yet here we are. So I would just kind of elevate this idea of knowing who your allies and those unknown allies that are right there with you in the trenches that you just may not be seeing.
I'm just going to say, yeah, we talked about allyship the other day, but I think the other thing is like that we're not alone, that we're bigger than, you know, like that sometimes we think we're alone. And so that allyship and remembering that we can lean on other people is really beautiful. And that actually is impactful. And so, yeah, the importance of allyship cannot be understated or underestimated.
So you've all contributed so much of yourselves in being a part of this documentary and as speakers at events after this related to the documentary. We're gonna have to end soon to go on to the question and answer period. I'm just wondering if any of you want to say some last things about the effects of the documentary or on you or on the public.
I can go. I think the one thing that sticks out, maybe not exactly to the documentary, but just to the process, is been the harder part of it, which has been kind of sharing this work with people in my own community. So, like, including my parents who still use the word, but in Spanish, people in the community who just don't quite grasp exactly what it is that we're trying to do with the subject heading change. And so it's been interesting to kind of have this side battle, a little bit different from what we did, but kind of completely tied to it, of thinking about change within different communities, specifically those that are affected by the word or who have been categorized for it. So that has been one of those things that I didn't think would come out of it, but that I'm still working through.
I think for me, one of the things, frankly, to be surprising is like and it's something I had said to Jill before, you know, like it seemed like such a Dartmouth specific experience in some ways that I didn't know how it would translate. And so it's been amazing for me to see just how it resonates with so many people. So, you know, we viewed it here at Western Washington, and students really related, right? And so what you're finding is that it has resonance, you know, at many different levels. And I think for me, some of that was actually unexpected too. I didn't know how it would translate, and so it's been really beautiful to see that.
Yeah, and I think just briefly, I'll sort of echo what I said at the beginning, that seeing, just the fact that we're still having these conversations and that people are watching the film, that they want to do something as a result of the film is like really exciting to me. And I think, I think that there are other factors contributing to that desire for action. I'm not saying that, the film is the one thing that is guiding people's principles right now, but I do think it's making a contribution to, for a profession that is, what is the statistic, like 80% white or something, I think it's making a contribution in terms of raising awareness and getting people to think about the ways that they can act in addition to holding certain values, the ways they can act on their values.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for all of your work and for being here. We really, really appreciate it. I'm going to send you over now to Caitlin, who is going to mediate or moderate the question and answer period. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephanie.
So hello, I am Caitlin Angelone, and I am the Access Services Librarian at the University of the Sciences of Philadelphia. So thank you again, everyone, for coming, and to everyone for attending this. And it's been a really interesting conversation. So I am going to start with, I would love to hear some more about dynamics on campus that the film talked about a bit. Did the subject heading change efforts get more traction because of other campus conversations about systematic oppression? Did you feel like the administration supported the petition to the Library of Congress, especially after it got extremely political?
I can take this one. Yeah, this was certainly not a great time to be Dartmouth College. There were a lot of other investigations for sexual assault. The year before this kind of came out, there had been a lot of protests from students. And so there were just a lot of communities working on campus to bring about change for their own individual communities, that whenever the freedom budget kind of came, it was really a collective of all of these issues that had been kind of festering for years, kind of bubbling up, and a moment of collaboration that brought us all together to kind of use our limited power to kind of make a stamp in a bigger way than we individually could have. And so I mean, I don't know the statistics, but it is a predominantly white institution. It was pretty much an all-male university up until the 70s. And so the dynamics of being on campus is a funny one, especially in the middle of New Hampshire, where there's not a lot of access to a lot of areas where there's a lot of other people of color, or just frankly ways to kind of get out of this bubble that is Hanover, New Hampshire. So it definitely it wasn't the catalyst that made this happen. I think it was truly co-fired, and the relationship we had with Jill and the library. But I think it was it was a moment in which the institution at large saw a lot of the issues that were happening. And so it did make it a little easier to get their support. At least for me, it felt like they saw it as a way they could win, like an easy win that they could add to their hat amongst the other problems that they had.
Yeah, I'll add on to that like Melissa said, I mean, Dartmouth is a 250-year-old institution that was founded to uphold white male privilege, and that continues to persist. And so I think the college, as much as it does try to redress that, I think that is such a strong legacy, and there are so many factors that that exist to perpetuate that, that it struggles a lot with true true change and true effort, I guess, earnest effort at becoming a more inclusive and equitable place. So we did, if you watch the documentary all the way to the end, you will see that the production of the documentary was supported by entirely by various departments and units at the college, including from the Office of the President. So it was very much financially supported. I think that the reality is that, like, there are very good intentions there. I think it remains, though, the documentary is a positive expression about what is possible, right? And the capacity of an institution to allow for these kinds of projects and collaborations and really, effort for change. But I think it's still an uncomfortable reality to have to grapple with, that because the documentary is not only about the subject heading change, but it's about the people that agitated for the change and why they felt it was important, and how the Dartmouth experience was wrapped up in that pressure campaign, right? In that need to make that change. So I think there is uneasiness, maybe with the project as a whole, as much as there is support for it. And I think that with most things in life, you do have to kind of hold polarities, right? You have to be able to say, or, it's never going to be like super easy to pull off something like this. There's going to be resistance. There's going to be sort of subtle undermining, but there's also going to be support. And you just kind of have to hold both of those things and do what you think is right.
Yeah, just quickly, I think the freedom budget which was really a coalescing of the communities of color on campus. Actually, it was a BIPOC movement, but basically demanding change from the institution was really, I think it opened up sort of like a moment of possibilities, and that basically, I want to go back to Oscar's point. I always say the same thing. Public shaming is a real powerful weapon. I think that in some ways, because of that too, it was an opportune moment because the institution also was being pressured to make change. Right. And so that, as it was not always smooth, and it's been conflictual, but I think that, the institution in part supported it, like out of self-interest, out of that pressure to show some kind of solidarity, but that, it worked in our favor. Right. At the same time, as you're speaking about like the other relationships, you're right. At the same time, the institution wasn't always supportive. So, we know that to students or, the rest of us. So that year that happened, we also know that 8 faculty of color were not granted tenure. Right. And so that and I was included in there, and so we moved on. And so the institution still has a lot of challenges ahead, but for whatever the reasons, I'm glad that they supported. I think there is sort of ambivalence in the support, but nevertheless it's there, and it is surprising because there is critique of the institution in the film. And so, but I think, again, public shaming, they probably, in some ways, probably felt pressured to do that. What would they look like if they didn't support this, really important, movement. When you go to the Library of Congress, right? Obviously, you're at the forefront of national news and, like the nation. And yes, public shaming.
So kind of similar on the same lines of public shaming and Congress. We have another, probably just one more question for you. So how did you deal with the fact that some members of Congress did not want to change the current language used to describe immigrants?
I can go first, but I also acknowledge that I've been hogging the mic. So Jill, no, okay. I would say at first I was kind of livid, mostly because this wasn't really meant to get the attention of Congress. This was really just a subject heading change like the others. And so we never really thought that it would really make a giant splash in the way that it did. But lo and behold, it's 2016 and we have a new election cycle, and obviously there's re-election campaigns happening beyond just the presidential election. And so when it happened, I will be very candid and say I was very upset, just because I didn't quite understand why they wanted to make such a big deal of something that really had nothing to do with them, or yeah, because the Library of Congress was quite separate from the things that they were working in regards to their job. But then after the fact, I actually was really glad that it happened, because it did bring a lot of public attention to this big giant change that was happening. And so that being said, I'm a little sad that it hasn't happened, just because of this weird political tornado that it caused. I'm happy that it brought attention and it brought conversations like the ones we're having right now to happen and to be current and to make sense in the moment that we're in. And I will also add here that, like we've been saying all along, this subject heading change hasn't happened, and I'm still hopeful that it will with the new administration. But I always knew that it was going to be a roadblock, but not the roadblock that was the end all be all. And so I'm hopeful that change can still happen.
I think for me, I just watched it from the sidelines. So I'll let Jill speak more, because you were present at that moment when that happened. But I, from speaking to students, I was no longer there anymore, but it was a letdown, just sheer disappointment, right? Because there was such euphoria, in sort of trying to get this change going. And it was such a hopeful process and moment, right? And so when students received the letter saying that they've been turned down, it was, sheer disappointment, right? And a little bit of hopelessness. And then things turned. And again, getting back to this notion of allyship, the work that librarians did to basically resurrect it. That's been amazing. So.
Yeah, I don't think I have too much to add there. It was certainly surprising to see it, the issue being debated on the House floor. Never saw that coming. But I think it spoke to really the power of this issue, and the fact that it was much bigger than a subject heading, a Library of Congress subject heading. And it really sort of, I forget what the copy is exactly that we have with the film, but something about how it, it sort of encapsulated or refracted the larger immigration debate in this country. And so, I think, just to keep it positive, because I don't really want to think too much about the haters and why they keep hating. But it was really powerful to see Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz speak knowledgeably about the function of the Library of Congress, the function of the subject headings on the House floor, you know, and defend its decision to make this subject heading change. And then it was, you know, equally, if not more powerful to see and to learn more about Joaquin Castro and his long-standing efforts to eradicate the term illegal aliens, even within the legal code. And so his solidarity on this issue was really powerful. And so that was really exciting. And we were, you know, just so fortunate to be able to connect with them and meet them in person and hear more about the effort, you know, on the sort of on the congressional side. So that was great that we were able to work that into the film, because they showed leadership and allyship again with the movement.
Okay, I'm gonna jump back in here. Let me do a little Zoom stuff. Obviously, the first thing is to, it's funny, we talked before the event started, we were all in the room talking about how for Dr. Najera, she's on the West Coast and it was dark where she was, but as she's, you know, this event has gone on, the sun has come up, and I feel like it's been such an apt metaphor for me personally. Since watching the documentary and just learning more and educating myself, and then to hear you all speak today, it's given so much depth to this topic and talked about all of the nuances and the inflections that I definitely never would have thought to think on my own. So thank you, Jill, thank you, Dr. Najera, thank you, Melissa, so much for your time today, and more than that, for the work that you've been doing up to this point, and I'm sure you'll all continue to do in your various contexts, and for exemplifying the openness, the care, the empathy that's really central to making change happen. So truly thankful. I'm gonna pull up just some final words as the chapter president here. So yes, thank you. And I also want to thank the program planning committee, whose names are here, because without them, none of our programs could happen. And also want to acknowledge that we received financial support for this event from the Institute of Museum and Library Services. We have the Pennsylvania Library Association's College and Research Division. And I also want to reiterate these guiding questions, because these are so central to everything that we talked about today. And I hope that you'll all continue to talk about in your respective communities and contexts. So what factors shape our professional values and beliefs, for better and for worse? How do systemic oppression and racism more specifically shape library and archives work? And how can our work serve as a vehicle for social change, especially that last one? I also want to invite the folks, if you really liked this program and are, you know, thinking about how can you get involved, being involved with the chapter is one way to help spur change. And that can be anything from running for the board, helping us develop our programs. So like I mentioned, we have a program planning committee. There's so many other ways to contribute. And also just joining the chapter, because through your membership is the way that we're able to do programs like this, and not just through financial support, though that's a big part of it, but just everything we do is really grounded and rooted in our community and our community needs, and learning and growing together as a community. So that's why I put little sparkles on that one. So just to wrap up and let you all enjoy your Fridays and weekends, thank you so much. And again, I can't say enough thank yous to our panelists, and you will be receiving a follow-up email just asking for some feedback on this event. And yeah, so happy Friday to you all, and we hope to see you at future events.
Bye, everybody.
You're still recording. Thank you so much for having us.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
it's been very enjoyable.